You are listening to the Green Living Chats podcast brought to you by EcoAmid Solutions in Ghana. I'm your host, David. Here, we discuss emerging environmental issues in and around the world. We use this platform to promote environmental related projects. So stick around with us. Here we go. Our economy. This conversation has been hidden and we never hear these conversations going on. For sure, there are many voices that are dedicated to sustainability, but when it comes to economics and sustainability, we all shut up because this is quite sensitive and no one wants to lose money. Have you ever thought about how our lives have been manipulated because of the economy and how it's affecting sustainability and our survival on Earth? Today, a teaching professor of economics from the Northeast University, USA, joins me on the podcast to have an interesting conversation on economics and sustainability. Madhavi Venkatesan is also a founder of a non-profit Sustainable Practices. We dive deep into an eye-opening conversation where we talk about GDP, demand, supply, economics, the economy, and how it has influenced our livelihoods and what needs to be changed. Of course, we cannot have this conversation without talking about climate change. So now let's get into today's episode. Hello, Madhavi. Thank you so much for joining me on the Green Living Chats, and I'm really happy that you could make time for our conversation today. Welcome.
I'm looking forward to it very much. So thank you for having me.
And as I started digging into this topic, I was really excited that you reached out that we could talk about this. And I think that is something very important that has been missing in the society. And going through your background, the discussions that are going on, I wonder where this information has been all this while. And I think that it's very important that we can get the chance to discuss this today. Normally, I like people to get to know the person that we are talking to and from the person's own view. And so how has this experience been for you, and what is your background? How did you end up with sustainability? Because I know you have a master in sustainability, but then you diverted into economy, if I'm right. How has this journey been for you, and why this transition, and why do you think there's a need for this advocacy you are in?
Well, I'm going to try to make the story short because it might take too long if I actually talk about everything that got me here. But actually, I got my PhD in economics first. So I got that in the late 1990s, and I did a postdoc, and then I went into the corporate environment. And my area of interest at that time was related to social issues. So my dissertation was based on the Black middle class in America. What initially were the elements that helped create and establish that. But when I went to the corporate environment, I worked for three major insurance companies, and it's an investor relations officer. And it's where I really started to understand what corporate social responsibility reporting was. I also saw that there's such a small amount of that kind of reporting and that kind of operationalized sustainability in the United States. And most of the corporate social responsibility reporting goes into the marketing and communications arms of most companies rather than in the CFO area where it actually becomes part of the way that the business is run. So these things, firsthand, I could see were a problem, and I started to think about my being an economist and also how economics has sort of fueled this lack of sustainable thinking, but also looking at academics. And you're 100% right. I went back and I got a couple of degrees related specifically to sustainability and environmental management and environmental law and policy. But I did that just to check the box because my PhD was in the 90s, and here we are in the next century. So I thought
Yeah.
it was important to refresh my knowledge base. But what also became very clear to me is the educational system is treating sustainability as though it's a discipline. It's not a discipline. It's a way of thinking, it's a way of life. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to fast forward the change that's needed by educating people at the school level, implicitly putting it into structures like corporate, like buildings, so that you have LEED certification and these other types of so-called green certification. So you have passive sustainability programs. And then also we're putting it out there by putting it in products. But unfortunately, if people are not educated enough to understand what sustainability really means or are not really checking the supply chain, they can be easily duped by certifications that really mean nothing. So right now, it's a multi-channel approach that I think is definitely having impact. People want to feel like they're not harming, but it's not having a significant enough impact because we aren't really telling people about the gratification and the comfort that they've become accustomed to are really part of the problem. So our economy is really part of the problem. The way that we have been taught or normalized to consume is part of the problem. And it's really opening up that channel and letting people see the transparency of the impact of their day-to-day consumption lives and the misery of other people, that perhaps we can still touch their empathy, their compassion, their humanity, their conscience, and have them make the change. The most difficult part, period, of this is that it's those people who actually get the greatest benefit from this system that are the ones that have to be the catalyst to change it.
Definitely, definitely. You already started talking about things that are really going to be very interesting in this conversation. I see economy to be driving everything that we do right now worldwide, everything. There was a webinar I just joined about a few months ago, and they were talking about who is polluting the environment, producers or consumers. It was a debate. They kept on going back and forth with it. And at the end, everyone made a point which literally made sense. Now, I want us to start developing this concept. I want us to start from what is economy and how is it really affecting our standard of living?
There are two ways to answer this. I'm going to do both. First of all, what is economy from the standpoint of a definition? Believe it or not, there really isn't a standard definition. There's a definition that we use in common use, but even that has changed if you look at decadal intervals. But right now, basically, I guess most people would think if you poll students, sometimes the first answer you get is it's about money. So let's put that aside for a second. What it really is about resources and individual needs as well as wants within those resource boundaries, at least when I was going through undergraduate school. Today, it has become so quantified that people automatically turn to a financial metric to define economics. But if we go back even further to where the word itself originates, it's about managing your household. So if you look at the economy, it could either be your home, it could be your community, it could be your state, it could be the nation, it could be the world, because all of these are our homes on different levels. The issue that we have today is that we no longer have a world where economies in different countries exemplify their own cultures or mirror their own cultures. We have an economy today that has been projected on the whole world based on one culture or one set. Maybe at the time, even we shouldn't even say it was a cultural response, but I believe we could say it is. So we're looking at something that was created in the United States in the 1930s. And then because of the issues related to the war and reconstruction after the war, became imposed on a global scale through the IMF and the World Bank, which I'm referring to right now as the gross domestic product, which at the time would have been the gross national product, but the measurement is basically the same. What you're looking for is the measurement of goods and services produced within a country, whether it's through the nationals or the domestic boundaries. That's what differentiates those two. But what it's telling you right there is that the goal is how much you can produce and sell.
Yeah,
So right there, that what you were talking about from your last webinar is directly related. It's all about production and consumption, but there is no explicit requirement for how we consume or how we produce. In other words, it's sort of implied. In a sense, there's either an implied amorality or applied morality. And unfortunately, because of the quantification of the measurement and the fact that that is the goal, how we reach the goal has not become important. All that
exactly.
matters is that you have the goal, and that's where sustainability takes a very different turn, because it's process oriented rather than goal oriented. And so it's a totally different way of thinking, and in many ways it's much more synonymous, more happy people, because most of our lives are all about process. Our goals, when we attain them, only last a few moments, and then we have to move on to another. if we don't take joy in process, then basically our whole life is only a series of single moments. And that's basically how things have distilled too, if we really look at it from a cultural orientation. But just taking a step back, so the GDP element is an imposition on cultures, because typically a culture is going to be aligned to its physical environment. And people will have different feelings depending upon the length of that particular culture.
You made mention of GDP. Now, the standard of living of people, and earlier you also mentioned something about how the economy does not depict directly the culture of the people. It's missing. We have lost the definition. How has this whole concept of GDP manipulated the standard of living of people, and how has it affected us on a normal day?
Well, GDP is not a measure of standard of living directly. It's supposed to be just a measure of production capacity. Indirectly, one could argue that it could be a proxy of standard of living under these assumptions. In order for GDP to hit its potential, you have to have employment increase, because your demand for employment will increase as your production increases. So that's number one. Number two is more people are working, supposedly their wages allow them to have a better quality of life because they can afford things.
Yeah.
That's number. See, there are two caveats there. One is the idea that labor demand increases so that wages reflect more what they of their value, and the other is that they're able to afford the things that they need. That's not necessarily true. And that part, is very similar to a trickle down theory. The idea that somehow if you put money into the economy, eventually it's going to trickle down to the bottom. That's dependent upon the virtue of those that actually have the control, right? So it's not like a direct relationship. So it's not necessarily true that the standard of living element is there, and I think there's plenty of examples to show that. The other issue that you brought up, though, is the cultural attribution. So I could have a culture where people live a very subsistence kind of life, very simple life. Perhaps, they don't have any luxuries, but they live, and maybe, from my standards, sitting on this side of the world, their life may look difficult, but perhaps they're comfortable because they have a do no harm mentality, and they live with what they need rather than have expressed what they want as a domination of the environment that they live in. Well, this economy tells you that your way of living is not good enough, that you should be dominating your environment. You
Yeah.
should be looking to produce, that the only way that you're going to be really valuable is if you have a market value for everything in your natural system. So that's how the cultural orientation changes, because it's very easy for some reason in this area. I don't have the expertise necessarily to talk about, which is a human psychology area. It seems to be very easy to push people into basically embracing that kind of lifestyle where they're gratified and their sensory perceptions are maximized,
Mhm.
than necessarily staying in a lifestyle where that may not be the case, but their impact would be lower and they're living within a set of moral boundaries related to stewardship.
I really don't know what you think about this, or whether you're going to agree with me or not, but this whole thing has changed the standard and the social development in such a way that now people have to work, just keep working, 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 and get money to feed themselves. They don't find joy in the jobs they are right now. And it's now defining the morality in the society. People look down on others because they are not, let's say, rich, or they don't have good jobs, or they cannot afford certain luxury things. And so the standard of everything has changed. And this has really affected even how we see children, teenagers, women. There's this sort of competition between us, nations, communities, tribes, and all that. I don't know what you think about this.
Well, I would agree. This is not a cooperative system. This is not a system that actually tries to even promote a sense of cooperation. And it's a system that defines winners and losers, which is a horrible way to be living your one life.
Yeah.
uh, to always be afraid of being on the wrong side. So I would also say it's a very fear-based system, because in order for you to be able to keep people in line, keep them working, keep them focused on just going to the next goal, going to the next goal, they have to be fundamentally afraid of what happens if they don't.
Yeah.
And and because of the fact that there is no safety net, because of what you just noted, if you fail in this system, no one was there to pick you up. You were looked as an outlier. You didn't make it. You're not successful. You couldn't do what the economy dictates that successful people do. So none of us really wants to feel like an outsider, because especially as we get older, we're more vulnerable to feeling ostracized, and so on some levels. So it keeps those among us perhaps that are also not most capable of challenging in line, and keeps that inertia going, which is very challenging, because it really wouldn't take much to change what we are doing.
Yeah.
But the fear that this system that we currently in generates in terms of people's behavior makes it that much harder to get them to say, okay, yeah, I only live one life, and my life is actually contributing to these ills. So let me take the sacrifice today for a better future. We haven't really created people that think that way anymore, because we don't give value to that kind of mentality.
I know that you're continuously teaching your students about the right way and sustainability and economics, and how we can get back to normal. I know that the initial mindset behind economics introducing GDP into the system was not this. So how did we end up here? And what are the things that you tell your students?
Well, I look at it from the standpoint of implicit values, the things that we assume within a particular time and space, but unfortunately we don't explicitly state. So I won't say necessarily this is true of the GDP era. We'd have to go a little further back, because I think there's indication even during this time period that values were changing. But let's just say, for example, that we live in a country, Christianity has dominated Western thought. Let's just say that there is a common religion within that country, and also a common denomination. So it's not like there are multiple interpretations.
Yeah.
That would be the underlying value that everyone in that particular country or that culture would have. You wouldn't necessarily then, as a academician or theoretical construct or creator, you wouldn't have to then specifically say, well, people believe this, this, and this, because it would be understood that would be the values. So from that perspective, GDP is just an equation, just like any other mathematical equation, and is purely subject to the subjectivity of the people within it that actually help that equation come to life. So if a sense of ethics doesn't dominate how you conduct business, if you do not feel for your fellow man when you are determining how much wage you're going to pay somebody, but just look
Yeah.
at their poverty to determine how much you can exploit. If you don't think to yourself, well, the trees are a habitat for someone else, not just me for an extra fireplace, then the way that that GDP model works in terms of the outcomes is totally different. But if you're only focused on the money,
Yeah.
then your goal isn't to care about any of these other elements. And in fact, the separation of the thought process of religious values from your business enterprise makes it even easier. So the separation of our religious thought processes has happened, right? It's for a lot of people, it's just something that you do with your family, your friends, and on Sunday. So it doesn't necessarily pervade other aspects of your life. You can say this is business.
Yeah.
But why should business be any different from how you would conduct yourself in any other interaction with a human being or the world at large? That's where the disconnect, I think, fundamentally occurs, is we have a system that is amoral and seems to believe that an amoral system is okay, when morality is probably the only thing that holds us in check, to prevent our vices from taking over our virtue.
Yeah, yeah. I want us to go back to production and consumption. And we've been going back and forth with life cycle assessments and the choices of producers and industries on which material they use for their products and packaging and all that. Of course, we are still producing a lot than we need. All these things are impacting the environment and climate change and all that. But people are using LCAs to confirm that certain materials are greener than the other. And that these same LCAs, I think that these tools do have issues, or probably they might not be considering something that, it's right, because some materials have been tagged green. Meanwhile, we know that there are certain aspects of it that have still have question marks. You are an expert in economics. And then, of course, you have a very good sustainability background. What do you think about our current LCA tools? How do we employ these economic tools in to assess it accordingly?
Well, life cycle assessment is something I think is extremely important, and especially if you want to start changing people's perceptions of their consumption of any item. I like to do it on a qualitative basis as opposed to a quantitative basis, and I'll explain why in 1 second. But what you're bringing up is really important because it highlights very clearly the subjectivity in science. So basically, you can have a scientific study, but by the omission of a specific stage of the LCA or omission of compounding impacts or impacts that occur over time, because you're looking at a small time interval, you can make things appear better than they are. So that's the question. And unfortunately, the layperson may not necessarily think about those things to critique the results that they read because we are all bounded by irrationality based on how much we're educating ourselves. So the more you educate yourself on thinking about, okay, what's the time horizon? Do they have all the stages in the life cycle? Then you can start to really be critical of this. And that's why probably lifetime learning is something that most people would advocate. So I first of all, I would just say science has its subjectivity. There is no such thing where a human being is involved that has 100% objectivity. And we have to remember that science has been imperfect for a very long time. It told us things that basically politicians and the church would have preferred us to believe. So it has the manipulation capability as well.
Yeah.
But going back to just the LCA itself and the tool from an economics perspective, I think it's very, very valuable. The reason why I push away from using quantitative values is the market itself is imperfect. So if I just look at dollar values to determine the cost of each stage based on how the market currently is pricing it, that market price may be only reflective of two simple characteristics, supply and demand. And that may just be reflective of the ignorance of the two parties, not thinking holistically with regard to the overall impact. So by relying on market prices to determine the LCA outcomes, I basically am reinforcing the inefficiency that's already known to me that prices are not indicative of the true cost of something. And then if we look at the life cycle itself, any product, one step removed from its original source, already has a footprint that's much bigger than we realize. So the moment you don't drink water from the stream, you drink it out of a container. You've already increased the footprint because the container had to be created.
Yeah.
So that's something that we have to recognize, and that starts to tell you when you look at your house and you have all this stuff, like I have all this stuff in my house. That's an enormity of resources. I mean, there's probably a forest worth of books in my house. And I didn't think about it at the time, but now that my eyes are open, I can see how much resource has gone into my life just to keep me at this stage, but only also because my economy, the way that people look at me, requires me to keep up a certain appearance. So
Mhm.
there's a definite level of social construction in all of this, that we have been constructed to believe that this is how we're supposed to live and this is how it's supposed to be. And then we use these words like evolution to justify or legitimize where we are. But we haven't evolved here. This is something that somebody benefited from by creating this system. And over time, we have a system that's not necessarily well organized, that's moved forward for a particular purpose, one that represents different power plays at different points in time. And those issues have continued to persist, those institutions, those ways of doing things. In the LCA process, let's just take a simple plastic water bottle. The first thing we talk about in my classes is I have my students do a life cycle assessment of a product that they consume, a drink, a beverage, and they have to do it for the container as well as the beverage itself. The first thing you want to do is look at the impact of plastic creation. Where does the plastic come from? Because now you hear about organic plastic too, right? Biodegradable. The reality is it's still resource intensive to make that one plastic bottle. So regardless of whether, let's say it could break down, which we know it can't unless you have a compostable, and that's still a
Yeah.
very unique circumstance, you're still a very high resource use, whether petroleum or corn. And then you just look at it from that point of production and what are the resources that are just used there. And then think about the consumption life, 5 to 10 minutes. And then it's thrown away, and the disposal life, incineration, landfill, or potentially recycling, all of which are toxic, just like everything up to the consumption point is toxic. You know, toxicity here, consumption point, you actually are consuming some of that toxin in whatever you're drinking. So
Exactly.
how can you, from that perspective, think that this product is a good thing to consume? So that's where, I think life cycle has a tremendous value. I do have a problem with these scientific reports on life cycle. I don't think there's sometimes you just don't need to go to that much detail when common sense can really tell you enough.
Exactly. And I love how you put it in one of your old submissions. I think a few years ago, you said this is called rational decision making, where we have to really consider the production of the product and the footprint of the product as we go through transportation to the production of the container to the consumption and everything. But I really agree with you 100% that there is something really wrong with how certain scientific reports are really manipulating these things to just end up pushing the concept and these materials and certain ideas on the public, making people feel good about it. Of course, I don't have very clear claims to this that some people have been paid to be doing this, but I feel like there is something wrong if we really know that this is not correct and all complete, but we still go on to push this vision on. It really baffles my mind, and I can think through it. I don't know if you have anything to say about that.
Well, I think the funny thing about this, and this is something that I've been looking into recently a little bit more, because I do teach a class also on religious influences on economics, is the influence of religion on these on this on the detriment to the detriment of the
Yeah.
environment, because of the fact that there is a perception among some religious individuals that the earth is here for us to dominate. Stewardship is not something that comes to their mind. And then because of a perception that the earth is going to terminate at some point in time, and this termination will result in heaven on earth kind of thing. That actually affects them even more, because they see the degradation as more of an indication that that time is coming. It's a very strange thing. Here you have Pope Francis and his encyclical with regard to the environment, and then you have organized religion on the other hand that actually doesn't take any kind of stand on the environment. So just from a grassroots perspective, getting religious entities to talk from the pulpit where they actually have people and they can create a call to action to enable and promote the actions that my organization is trying to take has been fruitless for all practical purposes. We have not seen mobilization of the so many people that go to church or listen into church services right now, given COVID, actually come up and help us pass these legislations to promote environmental protections. We really work with mainly lay people, what people that actually ties directly into a study that came out of the Pew, which is that spirituality has a stronger connection to sustainability than organized religion. So you wouldn't normally think that way, but
Yeah.
that is actually what's we're seeing. People who feel a spiritual connection, who are actually going back and looking at old pagan customs, who want to feel earth connection, they are the ones who really are mobilized to promote sustainability and stewardship. But that may be one of the reasons why the reliance that we see, the cognitive dissonance, is being pushed so much, because it ties into perhaps even a latent or not even completely understood.
There is definitely an influence when it comes to demand and supply. How does it go?
We do not live in a demand-based economy in the sense that consumers buy what they need. If you ask almost anyone in any, I ask this in my classes every semester, how many of you have gone to a store with one thing in mind and left with many others? How many of you have items of clothing in your closet that you have never worn? And inevitably, almost everyone in the class raises their hand in both cases. What that's a perfect example of is that we live in a marketed to demand economy, which means that supply basically advertises and markets to us and then creates a demand for a product, and this want eventually just becomes a need. So cell phones are like the perfect example right there. We didn't necessarily have a want for them, but now we are so dependent. We can't live without them. I used to know maybe 30 phone numbers by heart when I was a child, and today I don't know anything. If I lose my phone, I lose my connectivity to friends that I've had for decades. It is crazy how our system is run and how easy we just fall in line with the purchasing of products. Because again, with cell phones, we don't think about what's happening in the Congo, what how our cell phone is actually exacerbating social conditions there, how when it fails to work, that it just gets piled up somewhere because we don't have the capacity to actually break it down. And because it was never thought of in the beginning. We weren't thinking sustainably. So the product is a mesh of all these different metals that some of them have tremendous value in terms of reuse value, but they're not able to be separated efficiently. The other thing is we don't think to ourselves about the impact of planned obsolescence, which goes back to your original question of GDP. I mean, we're focused on growth, which means that any product we have is built to eventually break down. That is a problem in and of itself too, because that just shows you how inconsistent our economy is with the very need for stewardship. Just going back to that plastic bottle, I mean, the fact that we would have a product that first takes inputs that take years or thousands of years, right, to create, and then has a disposal that will take thousands of years or years to go away. That for 5 to 10 minutes. That's just crazy.
It's just crazy. And that is making a lot of these producers lazy. I watched a video, I think, this afternoon, and I remember quite very well those days when we used to buy Coke. We just buy the Coca-Cola bottle, you finish drinking, and you have to send it to the shop where you bought it from. And we never complained about it. You just send it back because if you want another Coke, you need to send the bottle there. But now you just use it and you drop it somewhere and you don't know where it's going to end up. You see bottles from different countries ending up at the shores of different countries. And this whole thing is, I just don't know how we managed to get here. I also had an interview with an ecologist, and he was telling me about climate change. That climate change has been happening over years, but just that the speed at which it's happening right now has increased. And you said the same thing in one of your presentations, that if we say climate change, it doesn't actually give us a good picture of what is happening. But the speed of climate change depicts what is happening right now. In your personal view, what would you say about the speed of climate change and how it is really affecting livelihood and the whole concept of economy right now?
Well, climate change is going to be the greatest catastrophe that we're going to go through, and we're going to go through it. The difference between us today and when other catastrophes on this kind of global scale occurred is that we actually have the ability to manipulate our environment to keep us alive. So, what I mean by that is we can build structures and have air controls in those buildings. So that means that those people who have the money for that are going to be okay. Climate change, the unfortunate thing is that to the extent that our financial returns have been based on the separation of our moral selves from our business selves, wealth accumulation may be more indicative of people who are able to, at least at some stage of their life, successfully separate those two. Those will be the people that will survive. So, what does that mean about our future? It means that we may potentially continue to carry this very selfish, self centered, self gratification mentality with us as a human species, even if we survive this particular period that we're going to be going through. Climate change is the direct outcome of the use of a GDP metric that's amoral. So if we look at the climate change impacts over the last 70 years, 80 years, that's actually the same amount of time where the GDP metric has taken off as being the measure of a country's value, so to speak. And it's a production based measure. So what does that mean? You need fuel in order to create the production capacities that you need. And what did we use? We used fossil fuels. So that's why this has happened. And the dependence of us on any good is related to the availability of energy. So this is the big issue. And now instead of looking at the situation that we're currently in and saying, okay, it's our overconsumption that's gotten us here, let's slow down our consumption, let's reduce our demand. All you're seeing is this desire to switch to so-called green technologies, wind, solar, hydro, perhaps even nuclear, without consideration that anything on such a large scale is going to have detrimental effects. So, just going back to climate change is one issue. It's the one easy to measure because we can all face it on a global scale. But the real issue is the human impact to the planet. Even if the other impacts don't show up in weather related events, they are still showing up in ecosystem related events. So, for example, offshore wind may have horrible impacts to underwater life. It may on land, it could have impacts to animals that we don't think about because they live under land too. It could have impacts to us. It could have impacts to anything with this sensitivity to hear at a level that we don't hear. The problem is we keep on inventing the same kind of answers, which are human centric, without taking into consideration that our sensory limitations are just that, limitations. We don't completely understand or comprehend what happens to the world outside of our ability to perceive.
I just want to ask you this because now the government and those who are supposed to make policies to make a change are so glued to the industries. And the industries, we know the agriculture, we know the fossil fuel, everyone, right? We know these people and we know those who are having heavy carbon print on the earth, right? Do you think that these people understand the urgency of change? And then if they do or if they don't, do you think it's too late to make a change?
Well, I think that we look at industry or we look at the government, both of them are a reflection of the people. So that's why grassroots movements are really, really important. We don't have a way of really getting to the people except to do it through these fragmented movements that occur in communities. So that's number one. And I think that's why it's so important not to keep passing the buck and saying, oh, the government should do this, or the government is not this entity that's outside of its own society. It is a reflection of its society. And we have so many countless examples of that. Same thing with business. Business needs customers to buy the product, and it also needs investors to buy their stock. So it's not a question of stopping, it's a question of exercising your power. On the consumer side, stop buying the product. If you own the stock, go to the shareholder meeting and demand that they change. Don't sell it. Selling is a cop out. Somebody else who doesn't care is going to buy it, and no change will happen. Wherever you can be an active element of the change that needs to be made, exercise your voice. You'll be surprised at how many people will stand in line once after one hearing one person say this is wrong. They may think to themselves, yeah, that's wrong. You might be standing alone for a month, maybe 2 months, but eventually people will join in because their fear will break down and they'll think to themselves, this is an opportunity to stand up for something I believe in, to make a difference, to be a change. The one beauty of this time period of being that person who stands up is that life doesn't give you this very often. But to be able to stand up and know you're absolutely right, that there's nothing that you're saying that could possibly be wrong, that the people that are condemning you are doing so because they're focused on either their selfish interests or they just don't understand the issues, or they just haven't been taught that freedom is a responsibility, not just a privilege. There's a beauty in that because like I said, life doesn't give you that many opportunities to be able to stand for something without being criticized because there's a potential hole in it. I think what we do right now when we stand up for values that have been excluded in the decision making for so long, we're standing up for a humanity that we want to see happen or come into fruition in the future. And changing people and changing values and changing how generations respond isn't really that hard. Our children are watching us. They see our behaviors and it's our behaviors that they mimic. What's important though, we never stop ever again in expecting people just to know what the values are, that
Yeah.
we actually convey them. They don't have to be religious values. We don't have to say that everybody has to go to the same church, but there should be fully understood values of how we look at the environment, how we look at each other, and how we respect and care for other living things that don't have the ability to do what we can do. We have the ability to destroy. They don't have the ability to destroy it at our level. So with dominion comes stewardship, because otherwise you have nothing to have dominion over. I'm hoping, my belief is that we have to first change the people on the ground, change our citizens. Then we push for that movement, the tide that will change all other aspects of how our societies are run. It doesn't have to be slow, but again, it has to be process oriented, because again, if you're only focused on the goal, you will be disenchanted very quickly, because the goal is not going to happen that fast.
So that's it for today's episode. I know and I strongly do believe that this conversation is going to start right among us. If you know someone who really needs to hear this, why don't you consider sharing this conversation with him? These are important conversations that we need to keep going on. Our economy and sustainability cannot be separated. Until we pay more attention to what is happening around us, change will never happen. Madhavi joins us next week as we continue our conversation on economics and sustainability. We will dive a little bit deeper into her non-profit organization, where she tells us about some of her projects she's carrying out with this organization. Why don't you go ahead and give us a star rating on any platform where you get your podcasts, and we will appreciate your comments on all our social media platforms just by typing Economics Solutions on Instagram, LinkedIn, Facebook, or visit our website www.economicssolutions, and we will be happy to see your comments. Till we meet again on the next episode, live green.